you very much, Janelle. Aaron, if you could hand control over to me, I'll be starting the talk here. Okay, bear with us. Okay, can we go back maybe 2 slides? I'm not sure if I can go back. Well, I'll just start here. Thank you for joining us again this morning. Yousef, Bozorgnia, and I will talk about opportunities for future research from this project. As mentioned earlier yesterday, this particular project really exemplifies the performance-based engineering approach developed at Peer over 20 years ago and adopted by so many of our research and practitioner colleagues today. And what this project has done, it looks at a very large question and enables researchers to deeply explore different components based on their level of expertise, and then come together and collaborate and coordinate to develop meaningful results. And also, as is typical in research, our project team discussed many options and paths to pursue during the life of the project, but we always had to come back to focus on the project deliverable within the limited time and budget. So Yousef and I, in collaboration with our project leadership team, Evan, Sylvia, Farzine, Kelly, Tara, Greg, Dave, and Brett, we have assembled future research topics that arose from our discussions as we focused on our specific scope of work. Of course, this is not all-encompassing. This sort of scratches the surface, but we thought that these would be interesting ideas to share. So I will admit I'm collecting thoughts from our experts. So if there are questions or clarifications that you would like, please do leave them in the Q&A down at the bottom, and we will address them at the end of our session. As a quick review, the project was funded by the CEA, and we greatly appreciate the support of the management and staff for this project. There were 2 project advisory panels, and I would like to acknowledge them at this time. CEA's advisory group did include John Osteris, Keith Porter, Tom Heaton, and Brian McDonald. And from the Peer CEA project team's project review panel, we had Steve Mahan at the inception of the project before he passed away. Then during the project, Colin Blaney, Doug Hobach, Charlie Scawthorne, and John Hooper continued to advise us. And we have, you've been exposed to all of our, a number of our researchers and practitioners who've been working on this project. The objective is to quantify the reduced building damage of seismically retrofitting crawl spaces of single-family homes. We've gone through that already. There is a lag. And once again, there were 7 working groups who focused on different aspects and made a set of deliberate selection of tasks focused on this project objective. Okay, just to let you know, I'm getting a bit of a lag. And so I did mention that we had some limited scope and time frame. I'm just going to need to advance. And this is a list of our working groups where our expertise arises from. So we'll get into this. With respect to ground motion selection and scaling, you know, in these analyses, there is a response spectrum with targeted periods, and then ground motions need to be selected based on that target. And then there's an average that's taken of those ground motions. There's always variability associated with this. And so how much variability is appropriate? Does it depend on the target? Does it depend whether it's a uniform hazard spectrum or a conditional mean spectrum approach? Sylvia Mazzoni's presentation yesterday about the ground motion selection process did show images that reflect this cloud of variability. And once again, this was a discussion point in our wood frame project and is frankly applicable for any project, not just wood frame. With respect to loading protocol, our project produced a loading protocol that addressed the specific needs of this project, as Farzin Zarain described yesterday. Future explorations of loading protocol could consider sequential seismic loading, such as aftershocks. Our project established an appropriate loading protocol for two-dimensional loading. Therefore, three-dimensional loading could be considered for future research. And thirdly, as Farzin mentioned yesterday, there are loading protocols designed for standardization purposes. And so therefore, if such a standard arises from this and other cripple wall studies, a pre-qualifying test loading protocol, or a set of them, would be needed. With respect to experimental testing, it is recognized that experimental testing is expensive, with lab tech services, construction of realistic testing specimens, and post-processing of data. Our project team, with valuable input from our project review panel, as well as CEA's technical advisors, our team was able to devise a testing program focused on supporting the analytical modeling of our project. Even so, if there were an unlimited time frame and budget, some topics that were discussed, yet tabled for future opportunities, are the following. It starts with additional testing of specimens that are deemed to be important to the loss modeling effort. Our project's large specimens had stucco extending lower than the sill plate. Tests without the stucco extending down the face of the foundation may yield some interesting data and also fortify the robust data that we have provided. Furthermore, testing more specimens with sill plates that are wet set into the concrete foundations and without sill anchor bolts would be of interest. Our project focused on horizontal or level foundations and constant height cripple walls. Extended testing to include sloped or stepped cripple walls would also yield additional and interesting information that would increase our knowledge of the behavior of these configurations. This lag, okay, sorry about this, guys. And then our project also effectively combined small specimen and large specimen testing to encompass and envelop a set of data to support the project's analytical modeling and simulation efforts. Of course, a full-scale three-dimensional shake table test program could provide a highly visible demonstration of the benefits of retrofit, where one specimen would be an unretrofitted construction and another specimen would be the retrofitted construction, similar to what our project provided with the quasi-static two-dimensional testing. Another benefit of 3D testing, and we've seen this in many other research projects, is that system-level behavior that reflects the interaction of two-dimensional planar components could be observed and documented. And then the results and data that arises from a full-scale three-dimensional testing program would inform similar efforts in modeling, simulation tools, and loss modeling results. And furthermore, a 3D testing program could further engage our colleagues specializing in damage assessment to help bolster research efforts with assessment tools. At this point, I would like Yousef to continue with future research topics, starting with modeling and simulation.
Great, thank you very much. So I assume I have the control. So these are not new. Already you heard it from Greg and Dave and Brett and others. We just summarize and we are gonna emphasize. Field validation. So obviously it's important because of the modeling, everything that we do, we need data from post-earthquake. So this can be previous earthquakes as well as collection of the data in the future earthquakes. It is unbelievably important because we heard it through our discussions that someone said, oh, I've not seen such a thing in such and such earthquake, or I have seen such a thing in another earthquake. So we need quantitative data. It is great if we can go back to previous earthquakes and collect either insurance data or for future earthquakes. We have a protocol that when we go to the field, instead of 30, 40 years ago, we used to go and just take photos and then without quantification, we need numbers. As Steve Main, God bless his soul, he was saying that we need how many windows broke and how many didn't break. We need to quantify really the performance of buildings, especially single family homes and so on. Do I have the control, Erin? Okay, then inventory. Again, Greg and Dave mentioned that we need to know really the inventory. Not possibly every single home, every place in their city, but we need a little bit more information, especially if you want to go to the next slide, which I'm going to mention. If you want to do really regional loss estimation, meaningful regional loss estimation, we need to know a little bit about inventory. And nowadays with the machine learning and artificial intelligence, possibly we can do a better job. And also to categorize features of these buildings, the way that, for example, for index buildings, we said such and such and such and such, rather than individual buildings. But we need to do a little bit better job for inventory of our building stock. This comes to the issue of the regional loss estimation. If you want to do really the impact of a major earthquake or even moderate earthquake, because as Evan mentioned, we don't need to go to 2,500 year return period. 250 years really can be very important for financial loss. So if you want to do really meaningful prediction for a regional loss estimation, we need all the tools that I have already mentioned. And it's good for everyone. It's good for CEA, it's good for research community, it's good for loss modelers. Then Brett also mentioned that in terms of cost and repair or retrofit cost, we need a little bit dig into the other variations. For example, Northern California versus Southern California, we have a little bit information. We need to do a little bit more to get to the sensitivity of the retrofit and repair cost in terms of region, house characteristics, and other things. Then again, already mentioned the issue of the rooms over garage. We have not investigated. There are lots of homes. My previous home was exactly like that, and also multifamily unit. We have not investigated. I think it's good for community that we dig into that issue. Then, again, Brett mentioned especially in California, costs of environmental issues like lead paint and asbestos can go unbelievably high, and it's very wide range. It is informative and it's good for community to dig into that, to narrow down the range. If you want to retrofit your house and you have older house in lead paint or asbestos, really how much are we talking about in terms of taking care of those issues? Again, Brett mentioned when in workshop that Brett had, the losses, the cost estimators, they came relatively into large variation. If you ask the 10 different cost estimators, and adjusters about one single case, one single home, you may get 10 different results. How is it possible that we reduce the variability on that? Is there any best practice guideline that, for example, we can develop? It is good again for CEA, is for insurance industry, and also for engineering professionals to have a little bit narrower version of variability of cost estimation from adjusters. Thank you very much. These are the, there are a lot more suggestions for future work, as you saw it in by others, as well as in our reports that you will see it hopefully in very near future. There are lots of details that we are proposing in various topics, all the way from loading protocol, ground motion, all the way to financial loss. The reports will have more elaborated topics. Okay, Grace, now I pass it to you.
Okay, thanks, Yousef. At this point, I'd like to invite our team to open up their cameras, and we have opportunity to address questions about the project, about any aspect of the project that's been presented earlier, as well as these topics and these opportunities for future research. So let me go to some of these questions here. This is a specific question about the analysis. From Tom Heaton, was incremental dynamic analysis used or considered? Perhaps this goes to Greg and Dave.
I can answer this one. So we didn't use incremental dynamic analysis other than scaling up our 2,500-year return period ground motions for getting a better estimate of the median collapse intensity. We actually used a multiple stripe analysis approach where we used, 10 different ground motion sets that are all consistent with the causal parameters of each of those return period bands. So it's actually 10 different ground motion sets run in an incremental way, but it's not scaling the same ground motion set up all the way from low intensity to high intensity. Is that, I don't know if that helps, or if Greg wants to chime in on that.
I can add to that. So
and Sylvia, Sylvia.
Yeah,
also.
so I can add to that. I mean, the multiple stripe analysis is equivalent to an incremental dynamic analysis, but it's one step up. It's a little bit more sophisticated because you have to have more, ground motions that are, what we did was each ground motion suite was actually corresponding to the return period instead of just, as Dave mentioned, just scaling records. But if you look at Jack Baker's paper about the stripe analysis, you see its equivalent is just the next generation. So again, we try to do the best science, and that's why they used the stripe analysis instead of just old-fashioned IDA. But it does the same thing, but better.
Thank you, Sylvia. While I have you and Yousef on the line, so to speak, could you elaborate a little bit more about the topic of the ground motion selection and this concept of variability?
Sylvia can elaborate. This is not only for wood frame, for any structure. You have a site, you are going to come with a target spectrum, whatever it is, can be UHS, CMS, or scenario, doesn't matter. You have a target spectrum at the site, you select 10, 20, 30, 40 ground motions, somehow that they go around the target. The issue is that when you go around the target spectrum, how much is really that variability? Is it, for example, in our project, we discussed it extensively internally, oh, the variability is too large, too small, and so on. It is good for community to come with a guideline that how much is really the motions that we select is proper level of variability. Sylvia, if you want to elaborate.
Yeah, I can elaborate on that. So in the old days, when people did numerical simulation by hand, they used 3-gram motions, and you wanted the very first set was you were using 3-gram motions that were spectrally matched to your uniform hazard spectrum. As we are improving in our capabilities and can run more and more analyses, now we're looking at, okay, can you give me some more gram motions? And the next step was still using spectrally matched. But from a structural engineering point of view, there's a, from the seismologists, they will tell you, oh, that's fine, you're good with what you have. But the structural engineer is interested in maybe having some period-to-period variability, record-to-record variability. And that's still an open question. We don't have an answer. Every time we try to find an answer, we actually come up with 3 more questions on it. It's a fascinating topic because in the old days, we were just looking at mean response. Now, even in the building code, they're looking at the extreme response. For example, in the building code, you need to meet certain limits in the average, but you cannot have more than 1 record causing numerical collapse. So we're expanding as our computational abilities on the structural engineering aspects are improving. Now we can run more and more records, and now people are wondering, what is this variability? And then is the variability coming in from the seismology approach, but also from the structural engineers? Does it make a difference? Jack Baker, again, had done a study on comparing scaled spectra with spectrally matched spectra, and looking that there was a bias in response with spectral matching. So it's an ongoing discussion. It's fascinating. People will look at a spectrum, and if you plot it in a log-log scale, you see very little variability. And then the structural engineers plot it in linear scale, and you see a different type of variability. So it's an open discussion, and we did the best that we could in representing what's consistent with what you would do with the uniform hazard spectrum, and then what you would do with the conditional mean spectrum. But as you saw in one of my slides, there's 17 and a half other options that you could do. It's a fascinating topic.
Thank you very much, Sylvia and Yousef. From Bill Graff, we have a question, perhaps for our analysis group. What about interior posts and interior gravity collapse when the floor slides off the posts?
I can chime in here and extrapolate on this one, because I am constantly asked through the Earthquake Brace and Bolt program, why are you not doing any retrofit to the interior of the crawl space? And I think yesterday we heard a figure of 3% drift. Are we seeing, the kind of drift that could pull the floor off of those interior posts and piers?
Well, yeah, Janelle, are you done?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, yeah, I didn't know. Well, I think just to reiterate maybe that in our analysis model, we do include those kind of interior posts. We don't give them any lateral strength, but we have the P delta effects of that. So that as in the cripple wall, the crawl space, all the structural resistance comes from the perimeter walls, but we do have the full effect of all the gravity load acting downwards. And as it goes laterally, that has that so-called P delta effect. That's kind of another driving force on the cripple wall. So we do have that included there. What we didn't model, and it would be really tough to model, would be that when a house comes off its cripple wall, it might get quite distorted. John Ostra sometimes calls it a fun house. Not that it's any fun, but and that really got into that assumption that we made in terms of the losses associated with coming off the cripple wall. Some people cited examples where the house came down very flat and the contractor jacked it up, and it was maybe that was a 30% loss value. Other cases where it comes off and it gets totally destroyed. So we felt it wasn't possible to track that sort of resolution, and that was part of the rationale behind assuming that for a cripple wall collapse, it's 2/3 replacement value on average.
Thank you. Thank you for those thoughts. Another question for the analysis group, perhaps. Was the condition of unbolted foundations modeled or considered?
Yeah, we did consider that. In fact, we had for the stem wall. Well, let me back up for the well, let me just start for both the stem wall and the cripple wall. We did ask the question: can the house just slide directly off the foundation? And I think the evidence we've seen, and Evan mentioned before. In fact, we did some tests of the wet sill condition. This would be one where you take the sill plate and just fit it into the wet concrete, and in fact, the adhesion between those two is great enough to give you quite a bit of friction. So for the cripple wall cases, we felt for sure that the weakness would be in the cripple wall for the existing condition. That is, it would fail in the cripple wall before it split off the foundation. Now for the stem wall case, we revisited that assumption to ask it to again look at that. And we looked at a lot of the data from past earthquakes and images of failures off of the stem wall. And all the evidence seemed to be the preponderance was that most of the failure was between the sill plate and the joists. Now, we should point out that there's a famous earthquake reconnaissance report from the Kalinga earthquake. And in fact, there were some houses there that slid off their foundation. From talking to folks, we were understanding that those houses were actually moved to that location. There was some, I'm not sure the reason for moving the houses, but basically older houses were moved to a new foundation, and those new foundations were smooth trowel finish with no bolting to it. So those are cases that did slide off, but we felt, and the evidence we saw, that was not a typical condition that one would find. So the short answer is all of our analyses did not consider that failure mode. We assumed the failure would be at the top of the sill plate to the joist. And the other thing too, as we went through all of our analysis, we tried to hit things that were middle of the road. We didn't want to kind of pessimize the problem to overemphasize the benefit that one would get from retrofit. We tried to pick what we thought were representative conditions.
Thank you, Greg. So we had detailed analyses based on 4 specific locations in California, and I think this was touched upon a little bit yesterday, but can we talk about the selection of those 4 sites when we were first considering 10 sites? How did that get distilled?
Let me say a few words, then I'll pass it. There are 2 issues when you select in terms of ground motion. Is the shape of response spectrum and also amplitude up and down. If the shapes of response spectra at 2 sites for the given return period more or less are close, the amplitude up and down really for our case is secondary because we vary that. So as long as the shape of a spectrum for the 10 sites or even more than 10 sites are not drastically different, then we can generalize from 4 sites to 10 sites or even more number of sites. As long as we vary the amplitude, which we do. One last point before I pass it. This is not also site-specific study. It is not that my house in such and such location of Los Angeles versus another house and so on. We want to really consider entire state of California. That's why we selected 10. From 10, we went to 4 because the shape of the spectra was not drastically different. So I want to pass it again to Sylvia or Greg or Dave.
Yeah, and I could make a couple comments on that and see if others want to comment. As Yousef said, the spectral shape of the ground motions at those 4 sites or at the additional 10 sites were not that different. And one way we kind of tested that was that if you took our damage functions for the existing houses, and if we take those for the 4 sites that we looked at, the damage functions, that's loss versus ground motion intensity, those are pretty close to each other. In other words, the damage function itself does not vary dramatically between the sites. So we feel that the damage function, actually Bakersfield is a little bit different than the other sites, but we feel the damage functions are representative of kind of high seismic sites. Now for the retrofit, I think as I mentioned in my talk, depending on the intensity, the retrofitted house is different. And so we felt that the 4 sites we picked were the kind of the spectrum of cases. Like Bakersfield was at the low end, that the plan set retrofit was a little bit conservative. San Francisco was actually exactly at the design shaking intensity as that the retrofit was designed for. In Los Angeles, the retrofit was a little bit stronger than the shaking in Los Angeles. And then finally in Bakersfield, the design ground motions were higher than the plan set. So part of the choice of the sites was to actually interrogate different different retrofits, you know, the strength of the retrofit. Yeah, no, Dave or Sylvia, anything to add?
I wanted to add to that. I think we have to keep in mind that it's not like, oh, you narrowed it down to only 4 sites. Numerically, you had those 4 sites, but as Yousef mentioned, you guys didn't exclude the other sites. Instead of just repeating calculations, these 4 sites are representative of the 10 sites of the whole state of California. So just because the computations are done on certain models, it doesn't mean that they don't apply to the whole state of California. So I think, you know, the question feels like, you know, oh, why did you leave out Oakland, or why did you not consider Oakland? Or it's more, no, Oakland was represented by these 4 models actually do represent Oakland. So it's not like sites were left out. All sites were represented by a smaller subset of analyses. So instead of running, you know, 10 repetitive analyses, they just ran the 4 that really mattered, that represented the rest. So I don't think we should see it as excluding the other sites. I think the whole
Thank you, Sylvia.
state was.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting, interesting perspective in reframing that. We have a question from Mark Tui. Has consideration been given to future research regarding how retrofitting can also add to property value and future sale price of home? In addition to the safety and property protection reasons to retrofit older homes with cripple walls, it would seem that the increase in property value resulting from a retrofit would be yet another way to convince homeowners about the importance of retrofitting. So it may help to make the argument that retrofit can more than pay for itself. Cheryl, would you like to address this?
Yes, I hope my sound is working well today, and sorry for that, everybody, yesterday. At the end of my presentation, what I didn't get a chance to say was what an honor to represent the culmination of this project. And I've put a lot of thought into this. My background is in public policy, and the economists have a method called hedonic pricing, hedonism as in what people want. And I am very excited about the opportunity from the EBB database of 10,000 retrofits that have been completed to watch those houses over time, to watch the houses that applied to participate in the program, you know, were very similar, you know, might have been suitable for the same kind of retrofit, but that were by lottery eliminated from being able to get the grants, so they may or may not have been able to complete their project. And what you do in a hedonic pricing model is to try and characterize all the different attributes of the house and how they contribute to the value of a property. And then you can look at that little coefficient on the 1 or 0 variable that says this building has been retrofit. So all else being equal, how does the sale price of a property change based on having this retrofit? So you have to have large databases in order to, you know, get the statistical variation. But by controlling for a large number of factors, we should be able to get some data on that. That's been kind of a holy grail. You have to plan in advance because you have to wait for sales data to happen. But there's a lot of turnover in these houses now, and as long as we can inventory large sets of yes or no, we have a retrofit in place that we understand, we should be able to get some data on that, and I think that's really exciting.
Can I add to that? Last year, I moved down to Santa Monica and I was buying a house, and that was a big advertisement. A lot of the homes that were for sale were saying recently retrofit, recently, you know, because you see it all over Santa Monica, all the retrofit that's being done. And so it's definitely being used as a sales pitch in Santa Monica, at least. So that's my one data point.
Thank you. Thank you for that anecdote, Sylvia. I'd like to ask Brett, one of the things you mentioned during the workshop presentation was that there was a lot more that could be learned. And you did summarize with a few statements of additional information that would be helpful, like payout information, things like that. Can you elaborate a little bit on that thought?
Sure, and Evan might want to as well, because we both discussed the value of this, and he highlighted in his recommendations as well. So I think that it's a gold mine of information that we think is out there because of the scale. There's been so many events and so much information collected that it has statistical value, and it has the ability to cross compare different variables, and it just has the reality. I mean, this is actually what happened as opposed to what we predict. So how I'd like to see it come into our hands, so to speak, is perhaps on a cost category basis. So Evan was showing in the loss model or comparison work that he led how, rather than overlaying curves, they had decided they could at least live with a couple of data points. And so maybe that's a similar kind of approach. We had in our adjuster workshop approach, when we were trying to coalesce all those Xactimate answers, we put them into about 10 or 11 cost categories, so cripple walls and, exterior walls and interior partitions. And those represent, many pages in the detailed estimates that adjusters do, but they're critical ones. And they're how a cost estimator on a new building project would think as well. It's similar to CSI kind of terms and specifications. So if we had anonymized values for, what was the cost in a particular event for a particular kind of house to exterior walls, then we could directly compare P58 values for that. We could directly compare, against the adjuster estimates that we had, and we could begin to kind of fiddle with the dials. So for example, if the building is taller, how does this change? If the building is in a damage state 1, 2, 3, how does that adjust in terms of the results that insurers are seeing? Are they seeing the same kind of trends that we were predicting, or are they seeing something different? I also think that it would help to understand sort of the way it is captured and described in their own files. And that might be asking a little bit too much, but kind of what level of information do they retain and what don't they retain? I was emphasizing the importance of sort of understanding as many assumptions and things as you can, but you can imagine at some point that becomes kind of overwhelming of what you track. But just sort of getting a sense of what's in and what's out would be of great value to be able to evaluate the information.
Evan, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's along the same lines. It's the more underwriting information and ultimate claims information that we can get, the more we'll be able to, test out specific factors. I know that even just knowing what underwriting information, is typically gathered and what can be gathered. I'd love to have a conversation with the insurers about, what's realistic to gather. We've determined that, the siting is incredibly important. Determining whether it's a raised cripple wall or a stem wall is incredibly important. So, how often is that information gathered? One of the things that we don't really know, and the modelers that we worked with, sort of discussed this with us, is that a lot of times the answer is unknown, on their underwriting. And so we don't know how that's processed. So, the underwriting and the claims information, I think one of the things that I'd really like to explore, the state of Florida has something called the Florida Public Model, and that's used to calculate, it's used to calibrate and test the credibility of wind insurance for homes and other buildings. And the insurers basically submit all of their claims information, and then researchers at places like University of Florida, Florida International, get that information and sort of create this Florida public model, which is a combination of all the data, and then that's used by regulators to say, okay, the rates that the insurers are charging is reasonable. So there's already there's a process in other states to have that information go to researchers for specific purposes like that. So I'd love to see something like that be set up in California as well.
Thank you for that thought. Interesting to see what's going on elsewhere, to see how other entities are using this information to be more proactive in this arena. We have a few more questions, but what I'd like to do, we have just a few more minutes before noon, is I'd like to wrap up this session and then hand it over to Janelle. But in closing, I'd like to thank everyone, our attendees, as well as our panel. And it's very clear that there's a lot more territory to explore based on the findings of this specific project. It's been a very rewarding and enlivening project, I think, for all of us. So on behalf of the Peer CEA team, project team, I'd like to thank Peer Headquarters team for supporting the coordination of the project. And on behalf of the project team, I'd also like to thank the CEA team for their support during the project and providing the opportunity during this research forum to share our project's applied research findings. I would like to note that this project's findings and recommendations come solely from the research efforts and the expertise of the working group leaders and our specialized teams. A final note is that detailed technical reports and project data will be posted to the project webpage and will be announced by Peer at the website, which is peer.berkeley.edu, soon after the end of the project, which is scheduled for mid-November. If you'd like direct notification of the project website contents, please subscribe to the Peer News Digest. Here's the commercial by clicking on the subscribe button on the Peer homepage at peer.berkeley.edu.